Okay, I think we're ready to start. So thank you so much for coming along, folks. So today we've got we're a real privilege actually. We've got a fantastic panel today, and it's something that I feel quite strongly about. It's touching some of the most pertinent issues of that's facing our world today. And we've got speakers from all different perspectives of it. So you're going to really gain a lot and enjoy it. I hope so. So my name is Ibrahim Ali. So I'm chairing this panel today. And I've got the thank you. And I've got the enormous pleasure of actually having 4 guests with us. There is a 4th guest, and I'll come to him in a moment. But they've got great insights and great expertise, and I really can't wait to hear from myself personally. But before we get to our guests, I think it's really important to actually paint a picture as to how we've got to where we are today. 20 years of conflict, 20 years of detention without trial, 20 years of rendition, of torture, of occupation, of military invasion, and 20 years of the erosion of all the freedoms and rights and civil liberties that working people have fought for generations to secure and to actually extend. And I think that's the sad thing about the war on terror in the last 20 years. There's been that steady, constant erosion, that constant securitization, and constantly trying to sort of securitize every aspect of our personal lives and public realm as a whole. And obviously, the main starting point post 9/11 is Afghanistan. And today you see the mainstream media has now suddenly rekindled this amazing interest in Afghanistan. Not forgetting that Britain, the US, NATO have been in Afghanistan for more than 20 years. It's been this whole thing of we came, we conquered, and there's just a silence. And then all of a sudden it's a case of we're now leaving. And there's no explanation, no context, no insights to why it's happened as it's happened. So suddenly you've had a situation where there's renewed interest in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and the wider Middle East as a whole. And you've got pictures of Afghans once again, in the news, and on our TV screens. And I think that crisis has a context. And unfortunately, many people don't necessarily talk about it. And I think that's the whole point of today's session, that we will actually hopefully get to the root of it. So beginning with the fact of the failure of the war on terror, an abject failure on every single measure, based on its own stated policies, it's a failure. And it's failed the people of Afghanistan, it's failed the people of Iraq, it's failed the people of neighboring Pakistan, of Libya, of constant intervention without any, first of all, plan. So their plan of what they plan to achieve, but also the case of why are we going into these countries? Why are we playing a destabilizing role, as opposed to a role of peacemaking and peace building? And that's not how, obviously, the President has actually worked out. So for us, I think it's been a missed point in politics here, but it's also failed people here as well. And coming to the community that I come from, the Muslim community in the UK, and in the West as well in general, they've paid probably one of the biggest prices at home in terms of the impact of the war on generation. My generation is a generation where we saw 9/11 as secondary school children. We saw the impacts of 9/11, and overnight, you saw a complete change in approach on how Muslims were talked about, spoken about, written about, interacted about. And at first, a lot of us thought it was it's just the media. The media have an issue with us and its politicians. But that poison has seeped its way through every single level of society, even as something as trivial as public services being securitized. The idea of access to education as being seen for a security lens, access to healthcare being seen for a security lens, access to even the issues of social care and safeguarding, that whole weaponization of real, statutory services from the basis of security and information gathering, intelligence gathering. And that's been the real impact that many people, here have actually been affected on. So we talk about securitization from a policing perspective, but from schools, the idea that you have a legal duty in this country to prevent signs of radicalization. And those signs, based on the Home Office's own documents and internal assessment framework, says things like, do they show an interest in supporting anti-war movements or the cause of anti-war movements? Do they have a sense of grievance or global injustice? I mean, put your hands up if you've got a grievance against global injustice. I know I do. And that's the same thing. And that's the problem that we have, that they are being judged from a very young age based on caring for their fellow people and humanity. So that's what's really quite concerning. So I think that's something that we've not talked about. But from my own sort of experience over the years, having worked in actually gathering intelligence regarding, or investigating rather, British complicity in torture, rendition, torture. The amount of complicity from our security services, from the British state, in terms of actually sending people to countries to be tortured because they want to outsource that dirty work, to gather intelligence, to then feed it back into its military-industrial complex. That's never ever been addressed. There's never been any inquiry. There's never been any, legally binding sort of review in terms of what role did Britain really play substantively in actually torturing other citizens, but also its own citizens as well, either here or abroad. And I think now we're at a stage where we have the end of the occupation, the military occupation of Afghanistan, but I think the question for us is, does the war on terror extend beyond just invasion occupation? A lot of people have this whole idea that the exit of Afghanistan has happened, we're now out of Afghanistan, and that's really the end of 20 years. But the legacy, the impact, the legislation, the policies, they all remain, and they remain so ingratiated in the system that we have today through all kinds of benign public services. So I think my intention really is just to set a scene from how I see it, in terms of the impact on the war on terror in the last sort of 20 years. But just to really say that I think it's to end on this point, I think it's really important we have the conviction not to forget actually what happened. And that's really, really important. The last 20 years in terms of, in early modern sort of human history has been absolutely remarkable in terms of how fast and how quick our freedoms, our rights, our liberties have been eroded so quickly, purely in the name of securitization. And I think it's a case of being very confident to say that, standing for human rights and justice isn't, it's very easy to do it in the sort of big, sort of publicly acceptable things, occupation, that's very easy to be a stand against now. It wasn't very easy in 2001. There was very few voices back then who stood against that. So I think it's just more remembering that we have to learn the lessons from the early days, in particular of the war on terror, who really stood against it in the beginning, and people were vindicated. We were all vindicated. People in the anti-war movement were vindicated in saying that this is absolutely wrong. It's a catastrophic failure of policy, but it's also a catastrophic failure of how we actually treat people and how we actually marginalise communities who are already quite marginalised regardless at the time. So I just wanted to sort of have that preamble and a slight moan. But I will come now to our panel of great speakers. We've got a fantastic panel today. Just to say that our fourth panelist, Jeremy, will be joining us very shortly, and he is making a quick dash over. So he will be here in a moment. So the plan will be that we have four speakers. So I'm just finding who's on my right. On my left, actually, so I say, we have Elif. So Elif is an anthropologist trained at the London School of Economics and a writer and organiser. She's an activist of the Kurdish women's movement and was elected co-chair of the UK Kurdish Assembly in September 2020. Her work includes collaboration with diverse progressive organisations and campaigns in developing political education programmes to better skill activists, organisers and campaigns for a better world. And she has guest trained at a number of London universities on the topic of feminism, radical politics, and global history. And Elif also works on the political education programme on the Labour Book Club. Thank you, Elif. Now, there is an official bio for Gargi, but Gargi being Gargi doesn't want me to read official bio, so I'm going to read what I think is so amazing about Gargi. But Gargi is definitely someone I've known for many, many years from the student movement. He's a well-respected academic and has done a lot of work in regards to the misuse, in particular, of feminism during the war on terror, and also real radical rethinking about racial capitalism. So, welcome, Gargi. And finally, on my immediate right is Joe Glenton. Joe is a journalist, a former soldier, an Afghanistan veteran, and author of Veteranhood, Hope, Rage in the British Ex-Military Life, which is at all good bookshops on the 9th of November. Welcome, Joe. Right, so if I can suggest we start with Joe. Yes. You have a few minutes there, yeah.
I'm going to have a moan. My first moan is that I've got a really stinking cold. So please, it's not COVID, I checked. Don't worry. But yeah, so if my voice goes, just bear with me. The first ever time I went on a plane, you might think it was Ibiza, it was actually Afghanistan. I was 22 or 23, a long time ago now. And I was deploying with all my mates and a company of Royal Marines to go to Afghanistan in 2006 for the first tour of that second phase, the 2006-2014 phase, where most of the British casualties were sustained down in the south of the country. I had no politics at the time, but it was a very confusing experience. We were given all kinds of narratives about why we're going to help little girls go to school. That's what the British Army does, apparently. We're going to stop the opium crop. That never really happened. I think it was a bumper year that year. We're going to build infrastructure. We're going to do all these things. None of those things turned out to be what happened. Whether they were with intention or not is completely debatable. And what actually happened was that the presence of British troops in Helmand became a kind of lightning rod for an insurgency. And that was the pattern which continued into 2014, when eventually the Americans kind of rescued us and took over, and that was the drawdown. And Afghanistan was forgotten until the last couple of weeks. That's what it feels like as a veteran. The war was completely forgotten. It's like this dirty little chapter that we don't really talk about. Then I went back last year under very different circumstances. As a journalist, dressed as an Afghan, went to Kabul, went to Jalalabad, Nangarhar, got lost in Taliban territory, in what we would call in the army a squeaky bum moment, in a Toyota Corolla, and basically to search for a group of a militia called the Zero Units. And I'll tell you about them because it's probably important. It probably says something about Afghanistan. They're CIA-backed. They're Afghans. They took over the kill or capture role in Afghanistan after the Navy SEALs and the Delta Force and the SAS stopped doing that job. So they trained Afghans to do it. I know a couple of weeks ago, Tobias Ellwood was suggesting they be made into a new regiment, like the Gurkhas, in one of his probably hourly, deeply colonial moments that Tobias Ellwood has. But our job was to look at what they did, to talk to the families of the people who they'd murdered. We spoke to a man called Sabir in a little village outside Jalalabad, whose son had been killed. Their village had been raided, a load of the infrastructure had been blown up. He dug his son's body out of the ruins of a mosque that their drone struck. We spoke to a family in Jalalabad whose 4 brothers, the 4 boys in the family, had all been killed. Weapons had been placed on their bodies to frame them as terrorists, which of course they weren't. So that was very much, that stuff was still going on as recently as a couple of years ago, and it's very much the kind of pattern of the dirty war in Afghanistan. And yeah, I mean, that was a shock to go back unarmed and have to engage with people and talk to them, but really, really interesting to go and do that, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity. I suppose the first question, we're talking about the socio-economic interests. Who did well out of Afghanistan, which is probably a very important question. And we've seen lots of facts and figures about the profits made by arms firms over the course of the war. So they benefited. I didn't. Personally, Tommy Atkins doesn't really benefit from these wars. Certainly your average Afghan didn't either. Lots of dubious contractors did. There were points where it turns out we were paying the Taliban not to blow up our convoy, so the Taliban benefited from it. Opium barons probably benefited from it. The Afghan ruling class benefited from it, and they took their money over the last couple of years because they knew that the occupation was going to collapse and fled to other countries with all their assets. So there was lots of profit to be made. It just wasn't by your average British squaddy, and certainly not by your average Afghan. But I think it's a really important question to address that. There's a question, what extent has the war on terror kind of come home? And of course it's very true. Wars in many cases happen far away, but it does come home. And I suppose what I can really address is the militarisation which we've had at home. I remember when I joined the military, we were not popular. Squaddies were not popular in 2004. And I talked to guys who joined in the 90s, and there was none of this kind of soldier worship going on in the 90s. There were separate pubs in Colchester and Aldershot for squaddies and civilians. Understandably so, because we were arseholes, to be honest. But what we've seen since then, and I think it's really down, there was a document in 2008 which came out, the recognition of armed forces in our society, fronted by Gordon Brown, no less. And they recognised that the wars were deeply unpopular, and they were looking for a way to make them popular, or at least crush dissent. And one way to do that, and the one that they pursued, was to try and make criticism of foreign policy into criticism of the troops. And this is my topic, and it's my absolute bugbear. And what happened was they basically tried to transplant the American model of troop worship, screaming in the airport lounge at the merest sight of camouflage, to the UK. It doesn't work that well here, because I think we generally think about the military in a slightly different way. But certainly I've seen that play out over the past 15 years or so. The climate of kind of militarism, like turbo remembrance, poppy worship. And what's accompanied that is a cohort of ex-military MPs, the Johnny Mercers, the Tobias Ellwoods, the Tom Tugendhats, who become very prominent, who are incredibly hawkish people. And it's also made the military very hard to criticise, and those kind of MPs very hard to criticise, which was precisely the outcome I think was being aimed for. And I would like to say it's very important. I cover defence as a journalist. It's important that we think about the MOD as a government department. You would criticise, you'd be comfortable criticising the DWP or any other government department. And it's absolutely critical that we continue to criticise the military. It's not sacred, it's not special, it's just a government department. And you kind of see this play out in Parliament where whenever any MP has to say something about the military, they have to kind of tee it up with I love the troops stuff. And I understand that's kind of the trap they're in Parliament, but we don't have to do that. We certainly should feel free to criticise the military. Very powerful organisation, very powerful department, lots of dubious people with guns. They should be subject to criticism just like any other organisation. So I think we need to step away from the idea that the military can't be criticised. It should be. And it should be held accountable for what it does. So there's a question about what does resistance and solidarity look like going forward. And you can see, I mean, it's interesting that there's loads of women out on the streets in Kabul, very courageously protesting the Taliban. I think it's incredible to see. And it's not like those women have just appeared. They were there, in many cases, protesting the occupation as well. And it's really cynical to me, and I kind of collide with this all the time, the way centrists particularly kind of weaponize women in the name of war. And it just seems so cynical to me to now, and I say that because I think we, to some degree, I mean, I wasn't an ideological recruit to the military, but to some degree we kind of internalised that as well. We kind of believe that is what the British Army is, a feminist organisation, goes around the world kicking doors in and saying, does anyone in here have any fucking women's rights issues? It's clearly not. If you think that, you clearly have not met 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, because that's really not what it's about, or any other part of the military. But that's also a deeply cynical argument. There are other people on this panel who can speak to it much more eloquently than me, I'm sure. But those are the people we should have solidarity with, I think. When I was out there, I also met a group of fantastic young peace activists in their teens and early 20s, and I'm absolutely terrified. I mean, it's really hard to get in touch with people at the moment in Afghanistan. It's a little easier now, but particularly as it was all collapsing and the airlift was happening. But organisations like that, like young Afghans who are in the country, who invested in it, who have skin in the game, it's really important to the Afghan Peace Volunteers, please look them up, to support groups like that. And I think that's what solidarity looks like. Because there's a sense if you talk to liberals, particularly centrists, however you want to frame it, that solidarity is basically bombing things. And it's just not what it looks like. So there are groups, if you're really interested in helping Afghans, there are groups out there, harder to get in touch with now. Obviously, they have to be much more cautious, but there are groups you can get in touch with and support, which is probably, if we were ever really interested in helping Afghans, what we should have done at the start, to be honest. But yeah, that's me. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Joe. Should be working, Gargi?
Is this working? Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Yeah. Obviously so. I was going to say in a mumsy way, I wonder if people might let people at the back in because it's tipping it down outside now. Kind of shuffle along if you're near the entrance in the interests of comradely shared dryness, perhaps. Shared dryness. Quite all right. I'm sure you'll do the same for me one day. Thanks so much, Joe, and quite a lot of what you said really segs into some of what I wanted to say. Did I want to say it? I only met Joe this morning, and we were both saying, it's a bit miserable, isn't it, to reflect on this last 20 years. It's hard to kind of rally some laughs around it. I think has already been expressed by Ibrahim and Joe that the war on terror is something that, although often in Britain now it's become a bit muted, that we like, oh, pretend that didn't happen, really has been a wholesale institutional remaking of politics at both local and global levels. And we are still living with that because many of those institutional arrangements are in play and don't seem to be any chance of, there's not yet a politics of what remaking that would be. I've been tasked to talk a little bit about gender. What I thought I'd do is remind people a little bit about how issues of women's rights and feminism were misused in the early part of the war on terror, and then how that might have played out in a series of institutional changes that have taken place under the name of the war on terror. And I know a lot of people in the room, you're too young, aren't you? You didn't live through that moment, but there's all these famous bits about Cherie Blair doing this terrible kind of, veiled eyes thing, as if oh, this is what we're going to war for. This is why the militarism is justified again. This is why force must be unleashed across the world because of those poor women. And I think we forget that kind of highly militarized imperial feminism hadn't been so loudly expressed for a while at that moment. So it's a real kind of rushing across, and Laura Bush, who never said anything, came out and was saying, oh yes, the girls, the girls. Some of that idea that it was a defence of women's rights has continued throughout the last 20 years. It has been quieter, but the issues around how ideas of development work, about who is seen to be radicalised, about what we are defending, have continually returned to the ideas of women's rights and occasionally of LGBTQ+ rights, although that has ebbed and flowed a bit. And it really has been a period that has unleashed this really renewed imperial feminism, as I've said, in both domestic and foreign policy, that it's something that's... So what I thought I'd try and do, it's dreadful trying to read off your phone, but to remind myself, to say what I think in my darkest moments, that the big headlines of the changes of the war on terror are, and then say one line about how each, I think, continues to represent a misuse of feminism. Then at the end I'll say why I think we need to think about that. So, the war on terror, and none of this is groundbreaking, you know it all. It folds national and international politics into each other, so that this idea of security there and security here gets kind of blurred. So that when you're racialising people here and subjecting them to state racism, there's this kind of continuum to fighting them over there, and also a very explicit discourse within the anti-radicalisation discourse that we here are linked to them there. That, it's taken literally, the idea that we're all connected. That meant, a bit closer, sorry. I always do it too close, so now I've gone, overcompensated the other way. At the same time, now I've lost what I was saying. There we go. So that kind of collapsing of the domestic and the international in both moments misuse the idea of women's rights. People talked about in that first period of Prevent that lots of money given to often spurious, but sometimes just poorly organised organisations who said they were dealing with women's rights. A whole discourse opening up here about how we must do things to further police and racialise certain communities because of women's rights. And all the time, this idea that Joe's already explained better than I can, the idea that military endeavours abroad, that's because, nice blokes, nice British blokes. Girls getting kicked, nice British blokes will go and help out. And that kind of circulated around the popular culture. Linked to all of that, the idea that immigration and terrorism are interrelated threats and interrelated crises. And I think that's become such common sense that you can almost hardly say it to each other. The ways in which we've become inculcated to just accept increasingly hyped up bordering as if foreign others always bring danger in themselves is so intimately linked to the discourse of the war on terror. The idea that these others, not only for our old-fashioned xenophobia, which frankly through the Blair years got remade a bit, because nice blokes who go and help weeping women over there can't be horrible racist bigots, but we can be sensible patriots who care about the national security. So that gave a kind of securitized veil, a kind of justification to a xenophobic politics that has had a much longer and deeper history, but is much harder to challenge when you collapse security and bordering. And frankly, we're still living with that not only here, but across Europe, in places which don't have the same kind of, imperial melancholia, perhaps, that we have. And I think that's also very, very hard to shift, because people want to believe that I fear the other because I'm nice, and they don't believe in women's rights, and they're homophobic, and if they come, it will change the nature of our community, which of course is completely adherent to women's rights and welcoming to LGBTQ plus people. So, last three things. So I'm being a bit process-led, because the war on terror feels a bit process-led to me. An erosion of due process, from individual hearings to state processes. That everything's such an emergency that you can't have a fair hearing anymore. I don't want to hear the evidence. I can tell that you're guilty before the fact. That was happening all across the intersections of the war on terror and hearings here. People may remember or may have forgotten all of the scandals really about secret hearings, about what indefinite detention under those kinds of extra-legal, I would say, processes meant. Linked to that, an absolute institution of thought crimes within how our domestic legislation works. Prevent is about thought crimes. Prevent is saying how you think and express your ideas means I think you are a danger to society. There are things in the current policing bill that echo and take that further, but also the ways that we're seeing the quiet but significant extension of citizenship stripping is also part of that. It's saying who belongs might be in your head. And what's in your head, again, misuses certain kinds of discourses of feminism. If people have already said that in terms of civilizational tests, what you are meant to say or think or believe, or I assume you believe, about women's rights and queer rights are part of what, who can have a human treatment and who cannot. And linked to all of that, the one that makes me still, even now, kind of, wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh no, this was one of the big wastes of my political lifetime, is the absolute rehabilitation of torture as apparently legitimate state technique. We have not rolled that back. I'm starting to fear we'll never roll it back, that once that is unleashed, the idea that because there's a civilizational threat, which must be fought off because the rights of some other weaker party, named women or named something other, must be defended, and we are the good guys, it's very, very hard to even the thin kinds of defences around that kind of level of dehumanisation. And then I think, oh, God, I hope I don't die too soon, because I want to live to see that remade. All of that, I hope you've understood that I think feminism, or discourse of feminism, was misused in every element of that remaking of institutional practices that we are still living with. But I don't think the answer to that is to say, well, feminism's a bit rubbish then, isn't it? Give up on that. I think the lesson is, for all of us who are progressive and internationalists, is to try and understand how it is that a way of thinking and doing politics, which is supposed to make people free, and was fought for and articulated and organised around up until now by people across the world in order to make people free, can be remade and reused to build a military machine at home and abroad. Because that's a lesson for us. We need to know why is it that the devil will always take our best tunes and take them better than us, take them more effectively than us, so that when young people of colour say to me quietly, not so sure about feminism, they mean imperial feminism. Isn't that the only feminism there is? when young white women say to me, I want to make a difference in the world through feminist organising, sadly, they often mean through militaristic organisations. We need to learn to hear how that happened and how to take it back, because there is no dream of freedom that we articulate that the devil cannot take to go and kill people with. And I hope that we'll have some conversation about that today.
Thank you very much for that, Gargi, and thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's a bit of a task to come after that. But before I begin, I just want to thank these two very incredible people translating this session into sign language. So can we have a round of applause for them? Thank you very much. Thank you. It is definitely not a task that I would like to be doing right now. It seems very difficult, but thank you very much. So, I really have a lot to say about this topic, this area. But of course, for the purposes of this discussion, I will try and focus on some things. And perhaps make a bit of a contribution in terms of some of the ideological underpinnings of what we call, or what is called, the war on terror, and its relation to the capitalist system, its relation to the nation state. And actually, Ibrahim, when you opened, you mentioned something about, going into countries without a plan and so on, and it all being basically a bit of a shit show. But I want to make the case that actually the war on terror functions exactly how it should. The lack of, the reckless lack of planning is exactly what it is designed to do. There is never really meant to be a plan, because there doesn't need to be a plan. What the function of it is to, of course, what is like popularly called destabilization of regions, but it goes much deeper than that. And bear with me, I'm going to try and bring some thoughts from here and there, and because we don't have that much time, it might be a bit messy, but please bear with me. And the reason I say that is because if we look at, and again, we don't have time for this, but if we look at the history of institutions and organizations like NATO and so on, and why they were founded, and therefore like the kind of timeline of how, certain policies and strategies developed throughout history, and then finally 20 years ago, this thing that was called war on terror was essentially declared to the world. And I say declared to the world because the war on terror did not begin 20 years ago. What war on terror, or whatever else, what comes with the war on terror has been happening much longer than that. And more or less actually can be tracked like in line with the history of organizations like NATO, but also other systems and policies as well. And the reason why I think it's important to kind of look at pre and post 20 years ago is because that was a turning point. And Gargi just called it a wholesale remaking of political institutions, which I certainly think is very accurate. And what I often like to call it is, that is when the so-called war on terror became an ideological pillar of the nation state, and actually more accurately, the capitalist nation state. And from then, there was a concerted war and strategic crushing of any struggle for self-determination. And therefore, anything that somewhat deviated from what was meant to be the end of history, and as Thatcher called it, there is no alternative, anything that deviated from that was terrorism, and therefore terrorist activity and so on. And we see this because often we make the legal arguments, and I think for the sake of argument, those are important sometimes, but we talk about international law and so on, but when it comes to the war on terror, and again, Gargi and both Gargi and Joe, touched on this. that's when law gets suspended. It doesn't matter because you're already guilty, because you've already deviated. So it doesn't matter anyway. And therefore, any kind of, listing, like prescribing as terrorist organization, any measures of criminalization is just because it's terrorism. And I think where some people kind of started to recognize what was happening, and in a way, sadly, in some ways it was too late, but I'm not saying it's too late to overturn this, but it was a little bit late, was about this prevent stuff. And of course that's really crucial, but sadly I think sometimes what the opposition to prevent plays into, and I'm not saying we shouldn't oppose prevent, of course we should with all our might, but sadly the pure focus on prevent and not understanding what the war on terror means, particularly for the British state, it plays into this politics of innocence, because all of a sudden it's about kids and it's about like young people, and of course, like I said, it's crucial. This is not an argument otherwise, but we need to be able to, when we are trying to oppose the war on terror, we need to be able to overcome this politics of innocence. It's not about that. It's about dismantling an ideological pillar of a system that is out to crush any form of struggle for freedom, particularly in the form of self-determination. And I mean, we don't have time to go into case studies and how some of these precedents were formed, but I think we don't need to look too far to see also where some of these precedents, in terms of the switch from, the war on terror strategically, but to the publicly articulated war on terror, that switch and how the process led up to that, we don't need to look too far. Ireland is just there. And we need to understand exactly where all of this comes from as well. And yeah, like I said, we don't have too much time. In terms of a bit of a case study, I want to talk a bit about the experience of the Kurdish struggle at the hands of the so-called war on terror. And I think a discussion around surveillance and some of the things Ibrahim also spoke about in terms of torture and stuff are very, very crucial. So I won't repeat that. And also, discussions around Schedule 7 and how, like I said, that's not about law, because Schedule 7 is inherently, it should, and actually if you look into it, even at any detail, is actually inherently unlawful. A lot of the laws and measures around the war on terror. But in terms of the Kurdish struggle, and again, it's always related, this is why I say we need to talk about the nation state and capitalism and so on when we talk about it, because often the people who are have to bear the brunt of the war on terror are mostly nations and societies and communities who also have had an experience with British colonialism. And, Kurdistan 100 years ago was divided by the British and the French into Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And, when we look at the timeline, it has constantly been a state of criminalization of the struggle for the freedom of Kurdistan. And in the last 20 years or so, this has been adapted into what is called a legal framework. And so, again, I think that some of the work that Ibrahim probably does, and I was very young then, and you probably were as well, but, when all this prescription came on, prescribing of organizations, of terrorist organizations, some of the communities that stood up immediately as a reflex saying, we know what's coming, was communities like the Kurdish community, sections of the Muslim community, particularly the Somali community, particularly the Kashmiris and the Tamils and so on, because there was this political reflex to know what was coming next. And these were the people who stood up immediately to try and fight for, okay, this has come in, but to try and fight to make it ungovernable, these policies and these strategies. And for a while, it actually seemed to work, in terms of, also the state didn't really know what to do with what had just come in. So there was this kind of limbo period of, they didn't know exactly how to deal with it, but of course, they have certainly figured it out now, and particularly with the imposition of the war on terror, of Schedule 7 and so on. And I want to kind of end by two things. I think sometimes when we talk about certain areas of, state policies and so on, sometimes I get annoyed by people who try and insert an understanding of nuance into conversations. But a nuanced understanding is actually necessary here, because sometimes when we're opposing the war on terror, British imperialist interventions around the world, we also fetishize non-violence as well. And it goes too far in that sense. So therefore, we can't really have an understanding, or we can't see when a people or a nation are fighting for self-determination. And often that means armed struggle. And often to resist that's what it means. And because from a particularly British perspective, often that non-violence is fetishized, we miss what we're meant to, we miss the points of solidarity that are very crucial, and the points of systematic solidarity. And I say this because, of course, solidarity with the Kurdish struggle is also a solidarity against British colonialism. It's a solidarity against capitalist nation-state system that is still, of course, trying to influence and impact particularly the region, but of course the whole world. And so when it comes to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and people have touched onto this, but I just want to very briefly make a comment, is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, particularly in this way, is not a win for anti-imperialism. Because like I said, that intervention was fit for purpose. It was meant to do exactly what it's done 20 years later. And, that withdrawal in that way obviously does nothing for the people of Afghanistan. And, we spoke about this when the US were trying to withdraw from northern Syria as well. And I think it's important to understand the withdrawal from Afghanistan within the framework that actually this is yet another strategy to show the world that, in a way to make people dependent on US and British intervention, because that withdrawal is very deliberate in that way. So it's to say, please stay, but forever. But actually, it shouldn't be about that, right? It's that, of course, what are they doing there in the first place? And there needs to be a plan of self-determination, self-governance for all peoples, but also you don't do it in a way that you essentially create like an addiction to this imperial power as well. And that's exactly what is happening. It's almost like we're withdrawing, we're your big brother, we're withdrawing, and actually it's to teach you a lesson that you really need us there. And so therefore we really need to not act like this is a win for anti-imperialism, but actually think about alternatives in how we can struggle for all peoples of course the Middle East, but also the world, to be able to determine their own future, to be able to govern themselves, and to be able to determine exactly how they do that. Yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, I think, but I'm going to end there and hopefully we'll go to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll try and be brief so we get into questions and discussion. And a couple of things I want to say to begin with. First of all, a big thank you to our signers for the work that they do, because it's very important, and TWT has always done this, that we have an inclusive debating atmosphere where we share ideas and share experiences and leave here stronger, energized, enthused, and more knowledgeable. And that's exactly what the World Transformed has been doing for several years now, and I hope it carries on doing it, because I think this is an absolutely brilliant place to be. And thank you all for coming, and thank you for all those in the World Transformed for the work they put in to organizing this event. And I'm very grateful for you allowing me in without any hassle or whatever. And I'm pleased to be here. Can I just say, a good friend of mine who cannot be here today has sent me a message which I'm going to read out, and it's from Shami Chakrabarti, who was our Shadow Attorney General. And she has done as much or more than anybody else to stand up for civil liberties in our society. 20 years on from the start of the misjudged war on terror is a good moment to reflect on a world even less safe, less equal, and less free. The Twin Towers was a terrible human rights atrocity. But if people threaten your way of life, in quotes, why give in and throw away your own values in response? One thing the war on terror has taught me is the power of solidarity and friendship in the struggle for rights and freedoms that is never over and always worth the fight. Shami. Well done, Shami, for what she said. And you've heard from others on the stage here about the issues surrounding the global war on terror and what's come from it. And as Shami says, we do live in a deeply unequal world, and that inequality has got worse during COVID, has got worse during the climate crisis, which is intensifying, and the threats and abuse of human rights around the world are massive and serious. And so we've always got to speak up for human rights, always got to defend the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the principles behind it. And so in doing that, that gives us the space and the opportunity to speak out against the many failings and misgivings we have of our own government. I've just come from a meeting organised by Stop the War Coalition in the Unite section of the Grand Hotel. And it's a shame that the two things are on at more or less the same time, but I think that is inevitably cannot be avoided in conference when everything's so busy. And we're reflecting there on the atmosphere surrounding what happened in 2001. And I just remember it all very well, as all of you do. The shock, the horror, the loss, the wall-to-wall media coverage of it, and then the instant idea that the solution to this is a military one. And the solution to this is to give unaccountable power to governments through, in the case of Britain, anti-terror legislation, in the case of the United States, by strengthening and empowering the Department of Homeland Security. And very few people were able to get a voice on the media against this in the United States. All credit forever to Barbara Lee for being the only member of the House who voted against Bush's completely unaccountable powers that he was given by Congress at that time. It doesn't mean that every member of Congress or every member of the Senate was automatically a bad person. It's that an atmosphere was created in which the only solution was seen as starting a war in Afghanistan. And it's very easy to go into Parliament, wrap yourself in the flag, praise the forces, praise everybody else, and vote to go to war. It's easy to do, temporarily makes you incredibly popular. And then the reckoning of the dead, of the bodies, of the insecurity, of the loss of human rights. And here we are 20 years on. We've now left Afghanistan, a country with insufficient food, no medicine, closed schools, deep levels of poverty, the mourning of thousands of dead, more than 1 million in exile, and desperate people under threat trying to get out of Afghanistan for the future. That's 20 years of Western involvement in Afghanistan. Thousands of Afghan troops have died. Several thousand American troops have died, and 457 British troops have died as a result of it. So surely this is a time for a reckoning of what we've achieved there. Just as Chilcot was a reckoning of what we'd achieved in Iraq, just as the massive refugee flows into Jordan, into Lebanon, into Turkey, into Greece, from Myanmar into Bangladesh and other places are reckoning of what war does and what war on terror does. And then the accompanying attack on human rights through anti-terror legislation. I've been in Parliament long enough to remember voting against the Prevention of Terrorism Act in the 1980s, which was bizarrely up for renewal every 6 months. It started off with the Labour Party fully supporting the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and a number of us said whatever the consequences we would vote against it because it was an attack on the civil liberties, particularly aimed at the Irish community in Britain, and eventually it was reduced to a 2-line whip. I never really understood what that meant, and then eventually the Labour Party finally got round to voting against it. But that was then replaced with the Terror Act 2000 and was then replaced by successive other pieces of legislation, including an attempt to detain people for 90 days without access to trial or anything else. And that, to me, was a deeply chilling moment, that we were going to introduce laws to detain people for 90 days. Now, I'd been through vicariously through my constituents the experience of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, where people were held initially for 7 days without access to lawyers or anything else. And I remember also talking to the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six about what happened to them when they were interrogated. Remember, the Guildford Four were the first ever people detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. People ended up confessing to things they couldn't possibly have done. I mean, it just was not possible they could have done the things they were accused of because they simply weren't there to do it. Yet, you put somebody in a room with no support, with no advice, with no representation, and they're confronted with a series of horror stories on the other side of the table. The mind does funny, strange things. And that is what anti-terror legislation and power does. It's been used all over the world. The French used it in the occupation of Algeria. The British used it in successive struggles against those seeking independence in colonies around the world. And it was introduced in this country. And then accompanied by Prevent, which was essentially sort of fingering the entire Muslim community as saying, somehow or other, you've got something to answer for because you're a Muslim. Well, that creates something bad and worse in itself. And so the effects of 20 years of the war on terror have been really serious. And so in discussion, can we think about what real security is? Is real security me putting up a barbed wire electrified fence alongside my house because I'm not sure about my neighbors? They might think it's a little odd, particularly if I put machine guns on the top in case they come too near, particularly if I have helicopters flying over their house to make sure we're keeping a good eye on them. How about leaning over the wall and shaking hands, saying, hi, how you doing? I mean, it's a simple human thing. Do you mistrust everybody, or do you try to move towards them and understand what they're thinking, what they're doing? After the horrors, and it was a horror, of the Manchester bomb during the 2017 election campaign, I was, like everybody, shocked and horrified, and I went to Manchester straight away to join with the people in Manchester who were mourning the horrors of what had happened that day. And then I made a speech during the election campaign on reflections on the war on terror, on reflections of where anti-terror legislation has led us, and reflections on what successive military interventions had achieved around the world. Many, many people advised me with intense urgency all the night before, because they heard I was going to make this speech, not to do it. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Just tuck in behind the government. I said, no. I believe it, and I'm going to make that speech because I think we've got to learn the lessons of what our foreign policy has achieved over the past 20 years in making the world a less secure and more dangerous place. Anyway, I made this speech, was not expecting a good response to it, was not expecting it was going to be an easy ride for the rest of the day in the media. And indeed, as I stepped off the stage and out of the hall where I'd made the speech, the media was already running anyone they could find who would condemn me. It's never difficult for the Daily Mail to find somebody to condemn me. They have thousands on speed dial ready to do it. Anyway, I was expecting that, and then we had a further debate with the government about when we were going to resume campaigning, and we duly did resume campaigning. And then a strange thing happened. YouGov did an instant telephone poll, and that found that somewhere around 60% of the people of this country said, A, we were right to make the speech, and B, we were right to raise the questions about Britain's foreign policy and its effects on our security at home. And after that, nothing more was said for the rest of the whole campaign on it, and the Daily Mail decided to find other things to attack me for. But that, to me, was an object lesson, how people do come to their own sensible conclusions, given time and the opportunity to do so. So I just finish with this. I want to live in a safe, secure society. I don't want somebody going around stabbing people to death. I don't want people shooting people on the streets. I don't want bombs. I don't want destruction of human life here or anywhere else. That means you have to respect the rights and human dignity of people in their struggle. I have many people from Kurdistan living in my constituency. The history of the Kurdish people, the way they were denied their identity after the Treaty of Versailles, initially briefly given that identity, and then it was taken away from them in 1923. And ever since then, that thirst to be able to speak your own language and your own recognition. And you realize where this all leads to. And then, many decades later, I'm sitting in a courthouse in Diyarbakir, in eastern Turkey, seeing the mayor of Diyarbakir, a Kurdish man, put on trial. What's his crime? Producing a public information leaflet about fire safety in Kurdish. That is where oppression and denial of identity and rights leads to. And so it does mean understanding the historical process. Those neat lines on maps all over the Middle East, those neat lines on maps all over Africa, put there. At the Congress of Berlin in the case of Africa, at the Treaty of Versailles in the case of the Middle East. And it also means understanding what real security for people is. Real security. Having enough to eat. Real security. Knowing your children will have enough to eat, will have a school to go to, that you will have a health service, you will have a care service, you will have a secure job and income for the future. You will breathe clean air. Your children will drink clean water and will live in an environmentally sustainable planet. And for many, that security isn't. It's a refugee camp. It's poverty. It's insecurity. And all that goes with all of that. And so the war on terror, where George Bush dreamt up the name, I'm very sure he did it himself. It wasn't a focus group. It sounds like George Bush, all on his own, who dreamt that one up. And what's it achieved? What has it achieved other than something worse and greater powers of incarceration of people? we always have to stand on the side of human rights, human justice, dignity, and civil liberties. They are the watchwords by which we live by, and we have to promote an international policy that isn't sending aircraft carriers to the South China Sea, developing more nuclear weapons, doing a pact with Australia and the United States. It's about peace in this world, and that's why I think it's so good that the World Transformed is having this good and serious discussion on reflections on the war on terror. And those that marched in 2001, 2003, and many other occasions, always remember it, and I think hands are being moved to indicate I should shut up. So I will duly do so and say thank you very much indeed for your attendance today.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I'm really sorry I didn't introduce you properly, but I was hoping people would recognize you by now. It's the green jacket, definitely gives it away.
It's Mexican.
Right. We have about 30 odd minutes for Q&A. So what I'd like to do, we'll do it in batches of 3 or 4 in different sections. So 1 per section. We'll just keep coming round, okay? So bear with me. If we don't come to you, we'll come round to you the next round. Okay. So anyone on the far right? Oh, good, you're awake. Okay. Okay, the man in the hat, if you can get a mic to him. And then we'll do it this section, that section. So if you can get a roving mic ready here as well for the next section, and then we'll take them batches of 3. As concise and as question-like as possible. I tried to.
Sorry, I don't know if the man with a hat each.
Right over there, standing up. Yes. Sorry, myself and him.
Hi, I just wanted to question the grounding of our opposition to militarism and domination and systems of violence on human rights, when the body that's given the human rights is already a colonized body, is already a gendered body, and is already deracinated and made to be a person who's just there to sell their labor. And I wonder if we could move forward to articulating rights, the right to a body territory, as you can express. So you have the rights that are grounded in a collective and refer to a space.
Okay, thank you so much. Right. Anyone over here? The person with the glasses sat down. Yes, another cap. Bias against caps, sorry. It's a secret society of cap.
Hello, everyone. Sorry. Hello, everyone. My name's Billy. First off, I'm going to start off with a quick chance, and then I'm going to get into the question. So, to quote Maxime Peake, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. War, what is it good for?
Absolutely not.
Say it again. War, what is it good for?
Absolutely nothing.
Thank you very much. Now, my actual question is, for people who aren't aware, the ACC in Liverpool have decided to book in the Association of Old Clothes conference, who are known to supply all sorts of weapons and missiles to defence and security, and also to the people and the military in Palestine and Gaza and all that, and that's very wrong. So my question is, what can, not just Scousers, but like other people in the UK, what can they do to help us Scousers to stop the arms fair in the ACC and to also stop other arms fairs happening up and down the country?
Okay, I'm going to take one from the very back and then one here. So at the very back, the hand with the face mask. Sorry, in the green. And please, questions. I love a good sing-along, but we need questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Lavinia Connor from East Worthing Shoreham. Lovely to see you, Jeremy. How you doing? I was a PPC. Jeremy, remember, from East Worthing and Shoreham. Anyway, my question is, great to see you, man. And I tell you what, we love you still over there, and we all love you. Thank you very much for being here. My question is two parts. Is one, we've had a fantastic debate this morning at conference about education, and that is primary to us winning anything. The hearts and minds of our young people. To tell them what colonisation was about, what imperialism was about, and how it ended up. Secondly, and most importantly, is that many of our young people go into the forces because they have no other occupation. So we need to defend against that. And I am not against the forces. I understand we need to protect ourselves, but the protection and there's immunisation, anyway, protecting yourself against the oppression of other races. We need to stop that. And as a Scot with an Irish history, we know all about imperial invasion, and it's still in our country in Ireland. And I look forward to us having a united Ireland very, very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, face mask. Person in the face mask. Yeah. So the lights are so bright.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, and thanks for the contributions. I'm very sorry mine isn't a question, but it is going to be concise.
I'm really sorry. It has to be it should be a question. Really.
I just want to signal boost a group called Afghans Beyond Borders. Okay. They're a new group. They're young Afghan refugees, Afghan students. I attended a demonstration that they arranged in London a couple of weeks ago. Pretty sparsely attended. They don't have those institutional links with Stop the War Coalition or those kind of people yet. But they are demanding better support for refugees and a lot of very important things. So you can find them on Twitter and Instagram at Afghans Beyond, and they need all of our support and our solidarity.
Okay, and I don't know how we're going to, the very last question, the person in the grey top. And then we'll take this round, and then we'll go around again. We've got plenty of time if we keep it concise and question-like. The question, please.
Thank you. There's a programme going at the moment on BBC. It's been a 6-week or 7-week programme that's been going on about the submarine, and it's like populist, and it's very, very. It's like, I don't know how it's like mainstream, and it's got great actors, and it's something that's very current, I think. But it's kind of just a massive advert for Tridents, and I'm confused as to what conversations to have with people about how to combat that. That's in a very generic, very, conversation person to person have. What can I say to people that are saying, I love this program, it was amazing, but we really need to make sure the Trident is happening because we need the defense. What do I say to people to combat that kind of almost subliminal messaging that's coming through?
Sorry, can you just repeat what the word was? It's Trident, you said.
I mean, I don't know if I can name the program that it is. It's called...
okay, we haven't got copyright.
Oh, okay. What's it called? Vigil. It's a program that's called Vigil, and to be fair, it's a really, really good program, and I was really into it, and it was the final. Oh, sorry. Well, okay, I won't give it away, but it was the final. Sorry. It was the final on Sunday, the final episode, and it's a great show, and I was really into it. Our whole family was into it, but how do you combat that?
Thank you. Okay, we'll start with we're really running out of time. If there's a mic you want to get to her quickly, very quickly, sorry, because we did have a comment, not a question here, to be fair. So.
Thank you very much. So for Iraqis like me, you talked about the reckoning. We see inquiry after inquiry, but actually what has happened, the bodies are still, for a lot of people, undiscovered, and for those that have been killed, they're still there. You talk about there's being a reckoning. We've got a document that says, yeah, the Iraq war was bad. What does that actually mean in terms of justice? There has been no justice for the Iraqi people whatsoever. And on top of that, when we talk about the oppression, the illegality of it, we feel like we're criminalised. Certainly as a secondary school teacher, we're limited on what we can talk about in terms of justice and peace. And when we normalise militaries in our schools, as a teacher, again, I have to look upon and see that as normal when I know exactly the impact of war on people like me who came here, who are asylum seekers, and then we have to normalise this horrific thing that happens time and time again. And I don't know what to do about it. And you say there's a reckoning. I don't believe there is. How can we campaign? How can we make sure there is a reckoning and for people to know exactly what the military represents internationally? Thank you.
Okay, 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll come back on those as quickly as I can. If you want to do something about the arms fair, arms trade, the Labour Party, Labour Friends of the Armed Forces, which is a kind of stage prop for the Labour right and arms firms, held a meeting last night sponsored by Leonardo Helicopters, who are implicating all kinds of recent war crimes in Nigeria. Those helicopters were used to blow up a school. So if I'm not in Labour, I've got no skin in the game, but if you are in Labour, that's one route to go down, to have a look at that. The lady in the back, poverty draft, it was ever us. So many Scottish lads served with me, whole regiments of Scottish lads, many of whom were injured, wounded, took their own lives later, so it's a huge problem. And it needs a broader systemic approach. Vigil, haven't watched it, but I would say it's part of a broader militarisation of culture. Like all of a sudden it's like Our Girl, SAS Who Dares Wins with that angry little fella Ant Middleton. There's so much of this stuff, isn't it? I think it's part of a broader militarisation of culture, and maybe that's the way to talk about it. It's everywhere you look, it's camouflage nowadays on telly. The inquiry, they're talking about an Afghan inquiry as well, with an incredibly narrow scope. It's not good enough. It's like what went wrong in the withdrawal, what went wrong with the ANA. It's never good enough. No one's ever held accountable. Same as Chilcot. Some stuff came out of Chilcot, but it's nowhere near enough. Who is held to account, exactly. And military in schools, I work for an organisation called Forces Watch, and we do stuff around military in schools. So if you look up Forces Watch, and we've got loads of documents on there, and it's an ongoing thing that we're trying to address, the militarisation of young people, which connects back to the recruitment thing as well. Thank you.
I really thank you for saying that, and I understand why you read out the thing from Shami about the basis of human rights, but of course everyone in the room knows that our culture was already a culture of violence and expropriation, and it's very hard for many people in the room to think, oh, let's go back to when the West was civil and as well as civilized, because that's not the history that... So I think we do have to think about what can we say from a language of rights, and I'm also very interested in the idea of the body territory, but I think that's part of our discourse. Like, who is entitled to what do we owe each other, what is repair? That has to be part of our collective discourse. Arms fair, everyone knows that part of what we're seeing is a resurgence of activism against arms dealers. And so, partly it's just to say that to each other, isn't it? That's core to our progressive values, to sit on the roof, to sit outside, to bring the sandwiches, to share some information about where the arms dealers move among us, as if they are philanthropists. I think Britain is a little bit behind that than perhaps some of our North American comrades, but that clearly was already in the British state, and it's still there. The thing I wanted to say, which I guess just because I like to say it, I am not convinced that if you want to change people's minds, you should do anything in schools. I really think either that is a misremembering or a willful kind of misunderstanding of how schooling works as an institution. if I wanted to persuade people of anything other than knowing when to sit down and shut their mouths, there's nothing I'd ever do in schools that was liberatory. I think that's a bigger challenge for us because we always act as if we could just get it in schools, then everyone would believe it. I feel like, that's not a astute reading of where schools function in our society, and it means we need to rebuild what our peer-to-peer and community learning could be. We're already seeing that, actually, in some of the other things about vigils like an opportunity, isn't it, and other things like that, and the resurgence of community activist training and the different 6 steps of difficult conversation that probably half the people in the room have been trained to do. That must, if you want to change consciousness, we need to teach each other, and we need to teach each other what reparations are. There isn't going to be any inquiry that atones for imperialism. I know that's what your question means, isn't it? So maybe we should stop writing another petition about that and think about what does repair mean in a peer-to-peer way amongst progressive people across borders. That's a bigger project, but it is our project.
I want to start on some of the school stuff as well, actually. For the last 10 months, the idea basically came from Gargi, but Gargi and I have been working on a series for the Left Book Club called What is Anti-Capitalism? And it came as a result of, in September 2020, when all this stuff was being labelled as extremism, anti-capitalist education material was labelled as extremist material. So we said, okay, well, obviously, as Gargi said, schools are not really a place for, to discuss liberation politics. So we'll do outside of the school. And we designed this series of talking about anti-capitalism in various different areas. And the reason why I mentioned that here is, one, I just want to reiterate what Gargi said about actually often schools are, in the kind of society we live, doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but in the kind of system we live in, schools are, of course, places of disciplining kids and therefore preparing them for society. And what is the society they are being prepared for is part of what we're discussing today, right? I just wanted to come in with that. Sadly, and that the space, this relative space that I feel like did exist, when I was in particularly primary school and secondary school, that exists less and less. And I think that's also related to, in some ways, when we talk about liberation politics, this person here asked about, I guess like it's essentially a critique of like framing things of human rights. But I think the relation there for me is whatever we're trying to do and whatever we're talking about, if the underpinning of that or the principle of that is not centered with an understanding of that understanding or struggle for freedom, then what does it mean? What does justice mean if it's not about freedom? What does human rights mean if it's not about freedom? And I think this is what we need to come back to. And often in the Kurdish movement, and I'm an activist of the Kurdish women's movement, this is some of the things we discuss and actually sometimes struggle to understand why it's not really like that anymore. In the late 60s and the 70s, when we look at the history, there was an understanding and a belief, actually, a hope that world freedom was possible. And it wasn't that it was possible, it was that it was inevitable. We have gone so far from that now. You're a bit kooky if you're saying, yeah, there's, world freedom, global freedom. It's a bit like kooky and saying, oh, but you must be realistic and, we must understand, the wins we can achieve and so on. But this is exactly what we need to be fighting for, because what's the point? If the aim of it isn't freedom, what's the point? What's the point of some recognition? And we had this session on Saturday about Sarah Everard's state violence and gender, and it comes down to that. There was a lot of discussion around when women are when women are murdered in some ways and who gets visibility and who doesn't. And there was an incredible intervention that was made by my incredible friend Dalia Gabriel, who said, actually, it shouldn't be about visibility. It's not about visibility. It's, if that doesn't mean, you know, Sarah, in that case, sorry, I'm going a bit off topic, but Sarah Everard, in the end, she's dead. Her visibility didn't mean anything, and after her, various other women who have also been killed. So if that doesn't mean a freedom, that means even in the most basic sense that you're still alive, then what's the point in any kind of visibility or justice or report or whatever we talk about? Just lastly on the arms trade, obviously any kind of arms trade fair, whatever it's called, whatever iteration it is, must be opposed by any kind of means in terms of organizing and so on. And I agree with Gargi that there does seem to be a resurgence in opposing these. This must be very central to the work we do, and we must make contributions where we can. So yeah, solidarity with anyone who's opposing these horrible, murderous arms fairs anywhere around the country and the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll quickly say something very briefly about all 6 of the questions, and thank you for the questions. The first one was about human rights and human rights organizations. I just say in reply to this, nobody really owns human rights. They're what we defend and demand for ourselves. And so I get lectures on human rights from all kinds of people, some of whom hardly understand or believe in the concept at all. And so it is about what we do ourselves. And if we have made a great gain in society, the right of freedom of speech, the right of assembly, the right to join a trade union, all those fundamental rights, you've always got to defend them, because they're always going to be under attack by forces that don't want us to defend them. And so it is a system of consciousness. And the role of the media in this country is often malevolent in many ways. From when we passed the Human Rights Act in 1998 onwards, most of the papers always prefaced it by saying the controversial, the unsuccessful, the damaging, the dangerous Human Rights Act. Like they do exactly the same on health and safety legislation and all those kind of things. Are there deficiencies in the Human Rights Act? Absolutely, sure. Is it wrong in principle to have it? No, it is right in principle to have it. So it is up to us how we defend those things. Nobody owns it. It's up to us, all of us, to take possession of that territory. Second point, question quoting Maxine Peake. She was absolutely brilliant. Well done, all those in Liverpool and in London that opposed the electronic warfare fair in Liverpool and the one in London. And I was very pleased to be in Liverpool to join in that march. And what was great was we're all marching through the centre of Liverpool. And there's something great about Liverpool. People came out of the pubs to cheer us on. It doesn't happen in every city in this country. So well done, Liverpool, and well done all of those that challenged the whole concept of the arms fair. Because listen, I'm in favour of us giving aid to the children, the hospitals, the schools in Yemen, absolutely. What I'm not in favour of is supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia to bomb the schools and the hospitals in the first place. On the debates on education and choices for young people, on education, Black History Month starts on Friday. I'm absolutely supportive of Black History Month, and I was supportive when it was first introduced. I just wish that the concept of a history of colonialism, a history of what the slave trade was about, who benefited from the slave trade and who made all the money out of it, was part and parcel of the centrality of what our children grow up with all the time. Because the teaching of history, it might seem sort of some weird thing you discuss on Channel 4 late at night. No. The teaching of history is absolutely fundamental to a child's view of the world. It's absolutely fundamental to how they view. Do they view Africa as a place of poverty and a place of despair, or do they view Africa as a place that was occupied, exploited, and damaged, and indebted, and is still paying the consequence? Take a more precise example. Haiti achieved its independence in 1797 by defeating the French forces, post-revolutionary France forces, to end slavery and set up the first black republic in the world. The price was very high. The price was all those that died fighting the French forces, but the price was very high for every generation of Haitians ever since, in that they were imposed a debt on them to pay compensation to the French slave owners and the French state, and that debt has never left Haiti. Those Haitian refugees now trying to get into the United States and being so brutally treated, they're victims of a whole historical process. So do we look at Haiti as a place that's a victim of colonialism, or do we say something bad and unfortunate happened? There's lots of different ways of examining history, and so I want our children to grow up understanding the contribution to learning, to music, to art, to literature, to science, to maths and everything that came from every continent on the world. It wasn't all in Europe, it wasn't all just in China, it wasn't all just in Mesopotamia. It was everywhere, and that, it has to be how we deal with that. And so I hope that we can do something about it ourselves. Dawn Butler and I discussed setting up Emancipation Education Trust in order to fund education packs and opportunities in dealing with issues surrounding colonial history. The other point raised by our friend on Afghans Beyond Borders. I'm pleased the organisation has been formed. It's brilliant. Well done, you, on that. And the need, well, you can take the credit on behalf of everybody else, all right. And share it out. Share the love, okay, share the love. But it is essential. And I met some Afghan refugees in the refugee camp in Calais. And I asked them about their lives, what they've been through. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Yes, they'd been exploited by people traffickers. Yeah, people traffickers are bad people, sure. Who created the market for the people traffickers? But occasionally, there's good news stories come out of it. I was doing a rally with John Trickett in Hemsworth a year and a half later at the rugby ground there, the rugby league ground there. And they said, there's two people in the office want to see you. I said, oh, okay. So I went over to see them, and there were these two very smart young men from Afghanistan who were studying, so on, and making great contribution and being brilliant in the local community. And they said, you met us before. I said, where? Don't remember. They said, you came to our tent in Calais and you talked to us there. We got across the channel and we're now here and we're making our contribution. The stories that will come out for future generations of the heroism of people trying to survive, and the Afghan refugees and the way they've been abused and ill-treated, and other refugees as well, all over the world. Can't we change the dial and have some humanity about refugees, not the abuse that's heaped on them by Priti Patel and so many other people? And question 5 was about inside the nuclear submarine. I watched that as well. And I became quite alarmed when the toilets got blocked up on the submarine and what was going to happen there. And I was very concerned about the whole... And it was actually a very, very well-made program. It was quite brilliant. It really was. And then you think, hang on a minute. Why are they there? What are they doing? And they've got this sort of box at the bottom of the submarine, which has got the missiles in. 24 missiles, capable of destroying the lives of millions and millions of people. And that's called security. Surely to goodness, can't we move on a bit? And as a movement, as a party, embrace the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we initiated, embrace the global ban treaty, because there can never be a defense against nuclear war. It doesn't make anybody secure. It just makes us all in danger. And it also creates with it the whole security apparatus that goes with it. And so I think, your point is well made. And it wasn't until it seemed an awful long time into the program before they mentioned there were any nuclear missiles on the submarine at all. It was all the sort of day-to-day life of people on the submarine. And I just find the whole debate about this, let's turn it into what is real security, as I said before, rather than the idea the ability to kill people makes us safe. It doesn't. It's the ability of us to live with each other that makes us safe.
Thank you very much. I was really hoping we can get one more round in, but unfortunately I've been given a very clear signal to stop, which is such a shame. So what I'd like to do, if you can all... Sorry?
Julian Assange. All right, Julian Assange. Fair point, Julian Assange. His case is coming up on October the... What date is it in court? Does anyone remember?
It's October.
It's October 26th, I think. I'm taking a stab at that, but you can check it on the website. We want a big demonstration outside the Royal Courts of Justice that day in support of Julian Assange. Diane Abbott, Richard Bergen and myself went to Belmarsh to try and visit Julian. We had a very long and very interesting conversation with the Deputy Governor, and Richard Bergen's knowledge of law and rights of MPs is wonderful. And overpowering and overwhelming, and I'm hoping it will result in a visit to Julian Assange. John McDonnell did go and see him in prison on our behalf. To me, Julian Assange is somebody that told the world the truth about what all this means and this war on terror means, and he should be free.
Thank you. Right, so I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to cut it here. So please put your hands together for our speakers. I hope you've all really learned. I've definitely felt I've gained so much from this session. And as you know, the World Transformed is definitely run on a shoestring budget. And it's all mainly vastly from more volunteers. So please, if you'd like to see more of this, hopefully, and for it to grow, please consider becoming a supporter. It's from as little as £1. And that all goes towards the TWT website and making more of this happen. So please, if you go onto your preferred search engine, type in TWT support, there's a link for you to donate from as little as £1, and it helps to sort of make more of these sort of opportunities for exchange of ideas and learning make possible. So thanks again. Please take part in the rest of the events that are happening, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.